1930s was a time of depression, but also a time of glamour. It was a time of world crisis, but it was also a time of joy, really. In this documentary, we're going to go a little bit more in depth to the decade, the 1930s. I'm Stephen Foss. This is the 1930s. Okay. Alright, my friends, before we go into anything else about the 1930s, we have to go over the singular most important event of the 1930s, and that is the Great Depression. Bum bum bum. So, just in case you don't know what the Great Depression is, it actually began in the early 20s, whenever the stock market was very prosperous, doing well. People were buying stocks, and it seemed like the stock market would continue to grow forever. But then, in the late 20s, a whole lot of people lost hope in the stock market, and instead of buying stocks, began to sell them off, which hurt the stock market very much, and it crashed on October 29th, 1929, and the damage was felt worldwide. The stock market crash would go on to become the defining incident of the 1930s. Unemployment skyrocketed. 1 in 5 Americans were unemployed. That's up to 25%. 13 to 15 million Americans didn't have a job. Many of the homeless unemployed became hobos looking for a better life. There was food shortages, lacks of money, and some families who were unemployed could not even afford new clothes. Each family had to work hard or they wouldn't survive the Depression. So you can see what it was doing to America. America tried to end the Great Depression by imposing tariffs on foreign imports, which kind of backfired, and then the whole world was hit by the Depression. So now the whole world is depressed. Eventually, at the end of World War II, cuts in spending, reduced taxes, and regulations effectively ended the Great Depression for good. So, who was actually to blame for the Great Depression? The angry populace of America wanted to blame Herbert Hoover, who just happened to be the president at that time, which is kind of unfortunate for him, so he got a lot of the blame. It wasn't actually Hoover who started the Great Depression, but hey, sometimes you just need someone to blame. So there you have it. The Great Depression. The inciting incident that kickstarted everything and influenced everything in the 1930s. Yep. Good stuff. Okay, moving on. Okay, now that we have the Depression out of the way, we're going to focus on the real first 30s thing, and that would be fashion. I'm going to be brutally honest and say I'm doing this next because I really have no fashion sense whatsoever. See? Let's make this quick. Women wore mid-length, bias-cut dresses with puffed sleeves, a belted waist, and a large collar. In the evening, they wore an old Hollywood evening gown, which was backless, sleeveless, and a long bias-cut dress. Also, they could wear high-waisted sailor pants and wide-leg beach pajamas, or casual sports clothes with skirt-like shorts, striped knit shirt. The trends were red lipstick, fur, floral patterns, and shoulder pads. Hats usually had flowers or ribbons. Men wore suits with padded shoulders, peaked lapels, tapered sleeves, and a V-shaped neck. Trench coats were very popular, and business manner hats, such as fedoras, were in style. Girls wore dresses or blouses with puffed sleeves. Black Mary Janes were a type of shoe that they liked to wear. There were knee or ankle socks, and sometimes pinafores. When you went to church, there were gloves that you had with a dress, and like everyone else, hats were worn on a sunny day. Young males, boys, wore short shorts and tall socks with shirts and shorts and pullover sweaters. There were suits for church,
A shirt and tie for school, usually, and hats on a sunny day. Or any day, really. 'Cause hats are cool, man! Fashion in the 30s was often influenced by movie stars and other celebrities. The thing is that not everyone in the 30s could afford new clothes. Only the rich or well-off, or those who were able to keep their job, were able to get new clothes. If you were unemployed, you couldn't get any new clothes. And sometimes you had to go to the donation box for some hand-me-downs, because that might be all you had.
What kind of clothes do you remember wearing? And did you like them? Yes, I did. But I'll have to shock you. I liked long sleeve shirts from the very beginning. But my pants, I wore Osh Gosh Begosh suspender pants, low backs. They were about $4.50 a pair. And they were made well. Like 2 or 3 pair of bib overalls would last me till they were too short to wear.
I had to dress up to go to school, and if you were going to anything special, I had to wear a dress. I couldn't wear my overalls and riding jonifers I liked.
And just like everything else in the decade, the Great Depression also influenced fashion. Materials for clothes were not always easy to come by, and changes had to be made sometimes. Nylon replaced hose, zippers often replaced buttons. Wool was probably used more, but no one likes wool. Anyway.
Alright, that's a wrap. I'm here at Holy Family Parish in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, to talk to you guys about religion in the 1930s.
This church is among the oldest in the city, and it was here long before the 1930s.
In a time of chaos and depression, the people needed something to lean on, and they found it in religion. And churches all over the United States of America found themselves teeming with new people who had come into the faith. And for them, that was awesome! There was a noticeable rise in the Protestant denominations, such as the Baptists, Methodists, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Disciples, Episcopalians, I don't know how to pronounce that, Holiness Movement, and Congregationalists, and of course the Catholic Church. And there were other new religious movements like the Jehovah's Witnesses that were founded in the 30s.
People also needed the church for a different reason. The church would organize relief efforts like clothes donations, soup kitchens, or just plain old donations. And those were donations that they needed, especially if they were unemployed.
And people needed those things to survive, and the church could provide those things.
Now, it is impossible to talk about religion in the 30s without talking about Father Charles Edward Coughlin, better known as Father Coughlin. He had a radio show. A priest who had a radio show. That's cool. And he was extremely well known because he had a radio show, and he became one of the most listened to voices on the radio, giving out the faith, hope, and support to a nation hungry for those things.
Eventually went to his head, and he started to get a little bit sidetracked.
Father Coughlin got fed up with what the government was doing, and instead of using his radio show to tell people about the good news of Jesus Christ, he began to just complain about stuff he didn't like the president.
Then it got a little bit worse as he formed his own political party and tried to run for president. A priest just ran for president, man! Father Coughlin also inspired a group of people called the Christian Front to go out French Revolution style against the United States government and tried to overthrow it with actual machine guns. What a time to be alive!
The world was by no means at peace. But religion gave people hope, strength, and a solid foundation that they really needed. And that's religion in the 1930s. Cars, planes, trains, science and discoveries, man.
The 30s were a time of advancements and discoveries and inventions that we still use in our everyday lives. And this will probably be one of my favorite parts of this documentary because
we get to talk about planes.
In fact, let's start with that.
In the 1930s, airplanes were advancing. Airplane manufacturers were beginning to move from less of a biplane design and more of a monoplane design, which was faster and more efficient. So fighters were moving from this to this. Bombers were moving from this to this. And commercial airliners were moving from this to this. And, okay, you guys get the idea. Right. Anyway, my point is that airplanes were advancing. The aviation world was changing. Planes were becoming more modern. Why? How did this happen? And the answer is World War I. During the course of the war, both sides had many breakthroughs in aviation technology and began building better and better aircraft and weapons. So if you didn't have the better or more advanced aircraft, you were gonna lose. So aircraft kept getting more and more advanced and modern until they morphed into some of the more modern aircraft that we see today. In fact, aircraft range had advanced so much that airlines could now transport people not only across the US, but to different countries across the ocean.
Aircraft travel didn't really reach big numbers until the 50s or 60s after World War II.
Okay, I suppose that's done now. But wait, it's not, because that's not the only method of transportation in the 30s. There was also, this. And we had cars back then, too.
The cars of the 1930s were beautiful, graceful, and luxurious, if you could afford one. Most people couldn't, or would have to be content with an older car from the 20s, if they could afford to keep it running.
Did you have a car?
Yes, my father did have a car to get to work.
We did have a car, and it was a Chevrolet. My dad was always assured us that we would have a car to ride in. The 1937 is the first car I remember of riding in.
My dad had a car. We went to my grandma's ever so often, and but we always had to take spare tires, 2 or 3, because the tires weren't any good in that time. And surely we had a flat tire before we got there, and we had to stop and fix it.
Another thing is that the Depression often forced people's hands into selling their cars so that they could get enough money to buy food.
So any family ever had more than one car. Children did not get cars. Most people didn't have cars.
Some of the more prominent brands in America and across the world were Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, Jaguar, Nash, Plymouth, and Aston Martin, among others. In America, the three biggest car companies were Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors. They were known as the Big Three, and during the Depression, they swallowed up any of the bankrupt little companies that went out of business. Also, for the first time ever, cars would begin to have radios in them. There weren't too many places that you could actually go to drive your car, though. There were small highways that crisscrossed the country, but there weren't any of the big superhighways that we see today with 4 to 6 lanes and tons of cars on them. The first big, almost superhighway would be the Pennsylvania Turnpike. It would come around in about 1939. And even then it was pretty small. It only ran from Pittsburgh to Mechanicsville, PA. Rail travel is another form of transportation, and in the 30s it was booming. Rails connected everywhere, and you could pretty much, if you didn't have a car and had enough money to travel by train, then you could pretty much get to anywhere you wanted by rail.
There was only one downside, and that was that steam power trains, which had populated the whole world since the 1800s, were finally being replaced by diesel locomotives, and later on, electric locomotives. Okay, moving on now. Wait, we haven't talked about bicycles, have we? Lots of people in the 30s had bikes because they were a cheap and simple way of transportation, and they didn't cost much to operate. Like, you didn't have to fill them up with fuel. And that's why lots of people used them, because they were so easy to use. Especially if you lived in the city, they were faster than walking as well.
We all had bicycles.
And that's just in case if you were wondering why we had a bicycle on the set. It's because that was another way that people got around in the 30s.
If you lived in the city, though, there was a different way of getting around, and it was called the streetcar.
Our mothers used the streetcar, and Pittsburgh had a very good public rail system where you could get on a streetcar. The fare for the car at that time was about 6 cents to 8 cents to ride the streetcar into Pittsburgh, and you could transfer to get to other parts of the city. But you had to stay on the rail lines, you didn't...
Let's look at some of the inventions of the 1930s. The jet engine was invented in 1930, Scotch tape in 1933, the frozen food processes in 1930, the electric razor in 1931, the trampoline in 1934, the ballpoint pen in 1938, instant coffee in 1939, car radios came in 1930, I already mentioned those, Heinz ketchup in 1930 as well, tacos came in 1930, the first airmail pickup flight was in 1939 in Latrobe, the first intercontinental airplane flights came in the 30s, and radar 1938, and nuclear fission, which is research that would lead to the atomic bomb in 1939. But possibly the most important of them all, the first chocolate chip cookie was invented in 1933. Cookies!
On an architectural note, the Empire State Building was erected in 1931 and remains standing today. And there was another architectural wonder constructed in the 30s, the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco.
Pluto was discovered as the 9th planet from the Sun by Clyde Tombaugh in 1930, although this was a title that would not last. And now for a musical interlude.
Music in the 1930s was lively and peppy, and another distraction from the Depression. There were 4 major musical genres that were popular at the time, and then there were lots of smaller ones. The 4 biggest genres were jazz, gospel, folk, and blues. Some of the smaller genres that came from them were gypsy blues, swing jazz, and war songs. Jazz was hot off the press, and swing music was very popular at the time. Blues summed up the sadly oppressed feelings of the American people. Gospel was influenced by the blues. Swing jazz, a variant of jazz, was very popular, and jazz itself was very good dance music. Music was very important in the 30s because it moved people. It brought out the best in them. And it distracted them from the depression. And it was something that they just needed. It was part of them. As it is today. As it has always been. And now let's take a moment and enjoy the music. Where would we be without food? It's wholesome, sustains us, and it's delicious. And so, this segment talks a lot about food in the 1930s. My interviewees actually had a lot to say on the subject, so I thought I'd let them take it away.
What was one of your favorite meals as a kid? Well, believe it or not, you would have thought T-bone steaks or meat or something like that. But mine was
Barb pie.
ready rice or red rice, and I enjoyed that. It was tomatoes with cooked rice, and I enjoy it very much.
Oats in the morning, hot cereal in the morning in the wintertime. We were able to have cold cereal in the morning. And milk was delivered to your home. You did not generally go to buy milk, but there was a milkman who would deliver it every morning. In the summer, they put it in a little, it wasn't styrofoam, it was a little cool box. In the wintertime, when it was very cold, the milk, which always had a lot of cream in it, would freeze, and it would raise the cap up. So when you went out to get it in the morning, you had milk and you had frozen cream. But we were able to get eggs. You had eggs for breakfast and bacon and eggs. And
Well, I think my mother was a really, really good cook. She made a lot of good cakes and things, but just like most kids, I liked hamburgers and hot dogs. They would have steak and I would have a hot dog. So I didn't want too much. I was too busy playing to want to eat.
you didn't snack much in the afternoons or so forth. Refrigeration in the very early 30s, you had ice delivered for your ice box, and
Now I'm going to talk about the foods that my interviewees have not talked about yet. This is the stuff that they kind of didn't talk about. So I have this in categories. For main courses or lunch, there was macaroni and cheese, meatloaf, casseroles, cream and chipped beef, chili, soups, creamed chicken of biscuit, hamburgers, hot dogs, salmon, spaghetti and meatballs, pork chops, and pigs in a blanket. Love pigs in a blanket. For snacks or sides, there were Ritz crackers, fruit, or vegetables. I don't exactly know what category these are in, but they used to eat these. Bisquick and Spam. I'm not entirely sure what Bisquick is, but I've heard Spam is pretty awful. For dessert, there was mock apple pie, black bottom pie, apple pie,
and a whole variety of pies.
A lot of pies.
Yes, there were lots of pies. For drinks, you could have Kool-Aid, orange juice, water, milk, most of the stuff that we have today. And then there was poor man's meal. So if the Depression had touched your family, you could make a meal out of skinning and cubing potatoes, frying them with onions until they were brown and soft, add slices of hot dogs or mostly any type of meat, cook for several more minutes, and then serve. But for breakfast, there were waffles or toast or cereal with milk. As John already mentioned.
We done already? That was fast. I haven't even finished my cake yet. Well, that's food in the 1930s.
The world has always been full of chaos. War, crises, politics, scandals, and that was true for the 1930s as well.
Next session, it's time to talk about some world crises. Crises. Politics. We're going to talk about politics and some wars and stuff like that.
To start off, let's look at some wars.
Some of the wars that happened during the 30s include
The Chaco War, the Great Emu War, the Colombia-Peru War, the Chinese Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, and the Second Sino-Japanese War, as well as any others that might not have been on Wikipedia.
We'll get to World War II here in a bit. Not only that, but the 1930s also saw the widespread use of a new, dangerous idea. And it was called fascism.
Fascism basically means that the dictator, as fascism usually has dictators, puts the country over the individuals. Hitler and Mussolini were both fascist and dictators. It also seems that no one in America realized what was actually going on in Britain, as my interviewees will show you.
No, I didn't. I wasn't old enough to take that serious, but I did hear them talking about it, but I really didn't understand.
We were, of course, 3,000 miles away from Europe. And so we had a mixed feeling on the news we were hearing.
We didn't have the pressure on them that you kids are accustomed to. And like your recent trip to Washington at that showing, and we're not orientated in that kind of thinking at that time.
I really was too busy with other things.
I rarely joined in any discussion like that. In fact, I thought it was kind of boring. I went out back if it was summertime and probably walked around the yard or worked on my bicycle or something interesting like that.
There was a very mixed feeling in the United States of a group that said we should focus on America first. So in the 30s, we were concerned more about the Depression than we were about Europe.
Next up,
The presidents of the United States, because they're always a big deal, especially here in the United States. So, there were two presidents who served during the 1930s, and they were
Herbert Hoover. Remember the guy who got blamed for the Depression and all that? Poor guy, I hope he recovers. Oh, and also there was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, better known as FDR. And he served a whopping 4 terms, serving all the way into the 40s and World War II.
4 terms for one president? That's crazy, man.
Let's take a look at the presidents. Herbert Hoover, as we've already mentioned, was blamed for the Great Depression, although it wasn't actually his fault. He was only faced with the Depression after he took office in 1929, and then spent the rest of the term trying to end it. He was also a miner, a high-ranking official in the U.S. Food Administration, and was the Secretary of Commerce before he took office. He was the 31st president, and not very popular. Unlike the next president, the 32nd president was Franklin D. Roosevelt. He served 3.5 terms, dying in his 4th. He had 3 vice presidents over his long stint as a president. He was famous for being stuck in a wheelchair. He had contracted polio and he couldn't walk. He could barely stand without canes and leg braces. But he was a very nice guy, and he did all that he could for those stuck in the hardships of the Depression. He even ended prohibition, something that probably made him very popular. He passed many acts, many of which prevented child labor and instituted the right to minimum wage.
Also, the tax rate in the 30s was 63%.
Anyway, Hitler wanted to take over the world. He called it Lebensraum, or living space in German. Hitler made the first move of the war. In 1938, the Germans marched into Austria and took it, with no resistance. Then Hitler demanded the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia because there were lots of Germans living there. The Allies had a meeting and allowed Hitler to take the Sudetenland on the condition that he would refrain from invading the rest of Czechoslovakia. Hitler agreed, and then invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. Meanwhile, Italy took over Abyssinia and then Albania. Japan waged war on China, again, and took over lots of land and China's capital, Nanking. In 1939, Hitler prepared to take over Poland, and the Allies told him that an invasion of Poland would mean war. Hitler invaded Poland anyway, because he was Hitler, and also he had just made a big deal with Russia so that he didn't have to worry about an attack from the east. So, on September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, and the Allies declared war. Poland then fell to the joint German-Russian invasion. Following that, there was a short period called the Phony War, where pretty much nothing happened. The Germans prepared for a new series of assaults. Then, Russia attacked Finland, who held them off. The Allies rushed to help Finland, landing troops in Norway. But the Germans held Norway's airfields, and so their airplanes decided to fight. The Allies were forced to retreat. And here's where we must stop, because the war would continue into the 40s. In fact, it would continue for an insufferable 5 more years. The 30s didn't just mark the beginning of World War II. They also marked the beginning of the Holocaust. Over the course of the war, millions of people would be put into prison, and many, many, many millions of people would be murdered.
Hey, dude! I'm trying to watch my movie here.
You're supposed to talk about recreation and leisure in the 1930s.
Okay. In the 1930s, families looked for any way to escape the horrible situation of the Depression. Now that my brother has interrupted my movie, and I have decided to let him interrupt my movie, let's talk about movies.
Some of the more famous movies of the 30s include Frankenstein, Snow White, The Wizard of Oz, A Night at the Opera, Gone with the Wind, King Kong, Duck Soup, Stagecoach, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, It Happened One Night, The 39 Steps, and The Lady Vanishes.
Did you go to the movies? By gosh, we did. 12 cents got us in on Saturday. Yeah. What did you see? Mostly cowboys. We seen either Gene Autry or Roy Rogers. Occasionally they threw in a short of Lash LaRue. He was a kind of a different kind of a cowboy. He used a whip instead of a pistol. Popcorn was a nickel a box. Imagine a nickel box. It was a big box, not a real large, but a good sized box. It would get you through 1 hour of movies.
Another way that they did it is by listening to the radio. Radios were hugely popular in the 30s. There were lots and lots of homes that had radios in them. Probably most of them had radios in them. The 30s are actually called the golden age of radio because there were so many radios around. And there were so many programs that you could listen to. There was music, like stories, action, excitement, and that was all on radio. That's a good deal. But what about the TV? Well, the TV had been invented in 1927, but it was still a new and radical idea, so it never really caught on until the 40s or 50s or so. If you didn't have a radio, there were other means of recreation. Board games were becoming insanely popular in the 30s. For example, Sorry and Scrabble became popular, but it was much overshadowed by the Parker Brothers' new game called Monopoly. And there were other ways to distract yourself. Some families came over to each other. Some families went to each other's houses to play cards. Yes. Other times people would solve puzzles with hundreds of pieces in them, which probably passed the time fairly well, actually. Many people read the newspaper to keep up on world news, or just American news, because world news didn't travel too fast. And lots of kids had toys, even if they were kind of simple if you had low budget because of the Depression.
We built things to play with. We built skateboards and clubhouses and all kinds of things, and climbed trees, and I built a little airplane for my dog. He would sit in it.
Your dog have a pilot's license?
No, he didn't, but he thought he did.
And of course, sports!
Did you play any sports? Softball.
I played volleyball and softball, and I was pretty good at it.
In the wintertime, so that we were able to do ice skating. The ice pond in Riverview Park was flooded to a depth of about 2 feet, and it was almost as big as a football field. So we had a very large area to ice skate.
The schoolyard was only a block away. They had a basketball hoop in the later years. When I was in about the 5th or 6th grade, they finally decided to put up a basketball hoop. But it was a gathering spot for us kids.
Have a football game or a baseball game in somebody's yard, and the parents would usually take part in it too sometimes.
In the summer times, the games were on the street. The boys had kick the can, or you'd kick it up and down the street. You had hide and go seek. We played a touch football game, or some softball, where we built our own little field. I guess you'd call it a mush ball now. I don't. You ran bases and so forth. And, that's what the boys did. The little girls played with. They had, you get dolls and things like that they play with, or cut paper dolls.
We lived on the edge of town, and I was able to hike around on the hills, and I was always interested in what I saw and the freedom of walking without having anybody holler at you, or signs to keep out, or any barbed wire fences to crawl through. And
in the summer evenings, we just usually sit on the steps somewhere in small groups of 4 or 6 and talk.
But we had a lot of fun because everybody played the games together. So it was a lot of fun growing up, even though it was really hard times in that I didn't realize it.
Alright, that is recreation and leisure in the 1930s. Now, back to my movie.
If you already did. Besides.
Here are some cool facts about the 30s. And all the stuff I forgot to mention earlier when I should have mentioned it.
Anyway, cool facts about the 30s. Here we go. Some of the most famous people of the 1930s were actors, such as Clark Gable, Shirley Temple, and Will Rogers. Joan Crawford, Janet Gaynor, Marie Dressler, and Robert Taylor were all also influential actors. Eleanor Roosevelt was the first lady of FDR. Babe Ruth and Ty Cobbs were baseball stars. Jesse Owens was an Olympic athlete. Glenn Miller was a band leader. Frank Sinatra was a singer, and Sarah Vaughan was also a singer. And there were lots of other people who were famous as well. The first Superman comic came out in 1938. Also in the 30s, people started to race their cars. They'd been doing it in the 20s, but it was really starting to pick up speed. No pun intended. Blacks were considered equals to white in America. On a bit of a more somber note, the 30s were peppered with some natural disasters and some not-so-natural disasters. For example, there were droughts in America which led to the infamous Great Dust Bowl years. There were floods in China, 2 hurricanes ravaged across the world, and, of course, there was the explosion of the Hindenburg. Alright, that is going to be just about everything. Let's head to an outro! Going?
Yeah, it is.
Alright everyone, that's going to be it for the video, and I really hope that you guys learned something. I just want to say thank you to all my brothers who have helped me so much for this video. While I'm at it, I might as well thank my teachers and everyone at CDT for helping me to understand everything. It really does hurt me to leave CDT. I'm really sad about it. It's the best school I've ever attended. I'm just going to say that. Thank you to all the teachers throughout the years who have helped me. And thank you to all the teachers who have helped me this year. And Mr. Fry, thank you all so very much. It's going to be hard for me to leave. So, that's all I'm going to be able to say. Thank you guys for watching. God bless.
Action.